Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to Asylums Uncovered, where we discuss the influence and impact of state hospitals on American history and the void left in their absence. If you're watching the video version of this, you'll probably notice I am recording in a new space. You'll also probably notice that the lighting isn't the best. I am still trying to get that figured out and get everything set up, but I didn't want to wait to record this episode. I'm really excited to talk about this one, so I just wanted to record it and get it out there and share it with everyone. 30 miles northwest of Philadelphia in Spring City, Pennsylvania, sits an unsuspecting property tucked away behind the trees. Beautiful brick and terracotta structure sitting empty on a once bustling campus. At first glance, to some, it may look just like some old dilapidated buildings, but this institution's history would echo for decades from the patient neglect and abuse that ultimately forced its closure. A location full of urban legends and local lore, what some may describe as a disgrace to the community, while others recall happy and pleasant memories. A place whose impact is still felt today by former patients and staff alike. I am talking about the iconic Pennhurst State School and Hospital. This episode is very special and personal to me. Pennhurst is a place that I have spent a lot of time, as one of my dear friends used to own the property. And looking back on it, I kind of feel like I took for granted having access to such a polarizing and historical location. I learned so much about the history, the patients, and one of my favorite photos from Pennhurst is of me coming across these old patient dresses in one of the buildings. And when you find things like that, you feel very lucky because these items truly are frozen in time. And then years later, you're fortunate enough to come across them. I truly miss Pennhurst, and I'm really, really excited to share all about it with you all. I also wanted to say, I know I haven't put out an episode in quite some time. Life has been really busy over the past few months, and I just truly didn't have time to dedicate to putting together an episode. And I didn't want to put out something that I didn't love and wasn't my best effort. But I'm back now. I'm hoping I'll be able to put out episodes on a more regular basis. At the turn of the 20th century, society struggled with how to handle individuals deemed different, often resorting to isolating them from the rest of the population. People with mental illnesses were typically committed to state hospitals, while those with mental or physical disabilities were sent to state schools. Although both types of institutions were government-run and funded, they had different purposes. State schools provided education, while state hospitals focused on psychiatric treatment. So just to be clear, schools equal education, hospitals equal mental health. And despite these distinctions, the terms are sometimes used interchangeably. Now, I want to make it very clear that Pennhurst was never an asylum. Although they may have had patients who were mentally ill, it was never an asylum. And I know that's what the Halloween attraction goes by, is Pennhurst Asylum, but the facility was never known as that. And I see this misrepresented all the time when people are talking about the history. Opened in 1908, Pennhurst was originally known as the Eastern Pennsylvania State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. And you might be thinking, what an incredibly long name, and what the heck does that even mean? Having the term feeble-minded and epileptic in the name of an institution was really common at the time, as it was thought that they went hand in hand. Feeble-minded simply meant stupid or unintelligent, and epilepsy was just flat out misunderstood, thinking that seizures were somehow connected to a mental disability. In the early 1920s, the name was officially changed to Pennhurst State School and Hospital, a name it retained until its closure in 1987. Patients were admitted from all over the country, but the majority were local to Pennsylvania. Upon admission, patients were classified three ways: mental, physical, and dental. Mental was either imbecile or insane, so you were either stupid or crazy. Physical was either healthy or epileptic, and dental was either good, poor, or treated. Originally, the facility was intended for children, but within a few years of opening, adults were also living there. Patients were under what was called custodial care, meaning that they needed assistance with daily tasks like eating or going to the bathroom. Parents didn't know how to meet the needs of children with disabilities, or maybe just didn't want to, so they would just drop them off at Pennhurst and have Pennhurst take care of them. Now, imagine you're a child, say 5 or 6 years old, and your parents drive you to this campus with all of these buildings and people, everything is unfamiliar, and then they just leave you. I mean, some parents would actually give up custody and their child would become a ward of the state. I can't imagine being a child and being dropped off somewhere that was scary and unknown, and then just having your parents abandon you. In the early 1900s, eugenics was a widely popular movement that intended to perfect the human race by only allowing people with desirable traits to have children. And this was controlled by forcibly sterilizing someone, meaning that they could never have kids. Pennhurst was such a proponent of eugenics that they started admitting basically anyone who is deemed unfit for society. And yes, this included criminals. And honestly, I'm not sure who thought it would be a good idea to mix adult criminals with mentally and physically disabled children, but that is the reality of what was going on. Pennhurst sits on a plot of land known as Crab Hill, and this particular area was chosen because it was large and viable for farming and growing crops. It could also house the initial 500 patients with room to expand. And as we've seen with other state institutions, Pennhurst operated as its own self-sustaining city to include its own power plant, and many of the patients worked on the grounds doing farming, laundry, or sewing. There were train tracks that ran through the property delivering goods from the outside world. One thing that makes Pennhurst unique was they had a store on campus and they actually had their own currency known as the Pennhurst dollar. There's technically 2 campuses at Pennhurst, the upper and the lower, and I will mostly refer to the lower in this episode as that's where I spent the bulk of my time. The upper campus didn't open until 1930 and it was known as the female colony. Both campuses followed the cottage plan, and we covered what this was in episode 2, but as a quick reminder, instead of having one large building like a Kirkbride asylum, the cottage plan used multiple smaller buildings for specific purposes. Pennhurst's layout included an administration building, an auditorium, a hospital, a dining hall, employee dorms, and more. Now, one strange tidbit of information I want to share, and please keep this in mind that this is not verified or proven to be true, but there's something very interesting about the greenhouse, which is now unfortunately demolished. There were rumblings that bodies were buried underneath it. And when you drive onto the property on one of the main roads, the greenhouse sits right along that road. Well, it used to sit right along that road before it was demolished. And when my friend purchased the property, all of the lower campus was sold to him except this tiny plot of land around the greenhouse, which honestly made absolutely no sense. The structure was falling in, the grass was overgrown. It wasn't like the state was taking care of it or using it for anything. So it just seemed really random that all of this land was sold except for this tiny little plot. There's also rumors that there was a tunnel that ran from the main central area of the lower campus to that greenhouse, and that had been collapsed. Again, this is not verified, this has not been proven to be true, but I will say it is quite strange that they did not sell that plot of land. Just saying. Like most cottage plans, Pennhurst was linked by an underground tunnel system, which made transporting patients and goods in inclement weather much more tolerable. Pennhurst is particularly infamous for its tunnels. When I first saw them, I was surprised by the size of them. In my head, I was thinking steam tunnels, not that big, but these tunnels are large, wide, tall. Think truly of a hospital hallway, but underground. Not all of the buildings on the campus were constructed at once. The administration building wasn't even completed until almost 10 years after Pennhurst opened. And the admin building is quintessential with its front portico and its cupola perched up on top. In fact, the cupola has kind of become the official, unofficial symbol of Pennhurst. I feel like if you've ever seen it, you'll know, oh, that's Pennhurst cupola. It's pretty recognizable. Inside the buildings, there was always rubber furniture everywhere, and this was so the patients couldn't hurt themselves on anything sharp, any corners, edges, nothing like that. And I've seen all kinds of colors ranging from this very ugly brown color to bright reds and bright yellow. In the basement of the Devon building, there is a room that has some artwork painted on the walls that could look like it's from the board game Candyland, hence why that particular area of the basement is called Candyland. And when Pennhurst was open and that artwork was first put up, it was probably painted with the intention of being happy and pleasant for the patients, but the juxtaposition of seeing it in a decrepit state, knowing the darker things that happen there, and we will get much more into that in a bit, it almost has this eerie feeling to it. While Pennhurst is often associated with scandals and abuse, it's important to acknowledge that there were also positive and enjoyable activities for the residents, like a baseball team, holiday parties, and music therapy. It wasn't all doom and gloom. When Pennhurst first opened, there were no resources to help patients gain an education or independence. But over the years, programs were introduced to teach life skills like walking, talking, feeding, and dressing themselves. And this brought a lot of pride and dignity to the patients. A lot of them went on to secure jobs, get their own apartments, get married, and lead very meaningful and successful lives. Not every patient had access to these programs, though, due to the lack of funding and resources, which limited the ability to offer more widespread options. There were plenty of staff there that were amazing, great people that went above and beyond for the patients, but unfortunately, these stories get overshadowed by the salacious scandal and abuse headlines. For example, the Pottstown Mercury newspaper was a giant headline that read, "Pennhurst, the shame of Pennsylvania." And I don't know if you can see this behind me, but these are mitts, actually, from Pennhurst, like restraint mitts. And I actually printed an image of that Pottstown Mercury newspaper that says that. So it's the backdrop where I have these restraint mitts in there from Pennhurst. So pretty cool little thing there. And this is where I'm going to address the difficult topic of abuse that took place at Pennhurst. Some of these details are hard to hear. They're hard to talk about, but this is all well documented public information. And I want to provide the facts while also being sensitive to those who are still affected to this day. In the 1950s, Pennhurst population surged to over 3,500 patients. And like many state institutions across the country, overcrowding and understaffing led to patient neglect and abuse. To put it into perspective, at one point there were only 9 physicians and 2 psychiatrists taking care of about 2,800 patients. This meant each physician would be responsible for about 311 patients, and each psychiatrist would have roughly 1,400. And with such overwhelming numbers, it was impossible to provide quality care. It was reported that there was no psychiatrist on duty at night or over the weekends, so if a resident had an issue, they had to wait until the next day or even the following Monday. The lid really got blown off Pennhurst in 1968 when local NBC reporter Bill Baldini did a 5-part expose titled "Suffer the Little Children." It is on YouTube. You can watch it. In fact, I would encourage you to check it out, but I will warn you, the footage is disturbing. It shows patients rotting away in adult-sized cribs, laying on floors, rocking back and forth, restrained in straitjackets. It's kind of crazy that they allowed Baldini and his crew to come in there and film all of this. That would never happen today. One of the more disturbing things that came out of this expose was footage of a physician named Dr. Jesse Fear. And yes, that is his actual name. You can look it up. Dr. Fear was an actual physician at Pennhurst. In this expose, he's talking about downgrading the patients. And I will play you a clip right now so you can hear him say it all for yourself.
We have found of late that it is quite effective to downgrade him a little bit and put him on a locked cottage with autistic type children or hyperactive children, a classification that used to be called low grades or that sort of thing. And it offends their dignity somewhat. They don't like it.
Well, you offend their dignity on purpose by putting them on this profoundly retarded ward. In other words, say a child with an IQ of say 69 or so would be put on in a cottage with children with an IQ of 10 or 20, and this is how you lower their dignity. Do you find this an effective measure?
We have found it in some cases to be effective, but in other cases, why it doesn't work out.
He also talks about injecting the patients with a cocktail of sedatives, and I will also play you that clip.
How else do you deal with patients that are hyperactive?
I have given some of them intravenous pentobarbital sodium on occasion. Otherwise, they would do harm to themselves and others.
In other words, you drug them.
Absolutely.
And if you're thinking to yourself, this is horrific, this is shocking, how did this ever happen? Well, it's also reported that children who had the tendency to bite would also have their teeth removed without anesthesia. I will be the first person to tell you I am horrified of the dentist. I hate going to the dentist. I can't stand the drilling, I cannot stand any of it. I cannot imagine being a child and having all of your teeth pulled without anesthesia. To me, the thought of that is just, it is shocking. Many of the children at Pennhurst had nothing wrong with them, and sadly, a lot of them regressed during their time there. They stopped speaking, they became more antisocial, and overall, they just declined. The environment at Pennhurst was simply not conducive to their well-being or their development. And you would think this kind of expose would push for a complete overhaul of how things were being run, but it actually didn't make that big of an impact. And you have to think, in the 1960s, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't a way to really bring awareness to things like this like there is today, and the general public often overlooked or just simply misunderstood those with disabilities, making it hard to gain that traction or that change. But what did start making an impact were the multiple court cases that involved Pennhurst. And I don't want to dive too in the weeds with every single one, but there are a few that I want to mention because overall they had a really profound impact on Pennhurst and the disability rights movement overall. The first is the 1983 case where 9 Pennhurst aides were charged with patient abuse. According to the Justice Department, this was the first federal prosecution brought against employees of mental institutions for abusing patients, which is a really big deal. Facilities all across the country were riddled with abusive staff, and this set a strong precedent that this would not be tolerated and people would be held accountable. The next case I want to tell you about is the infamous Halderman vs. Pennhurst case. And if you've ever looked into any history of Pennhurst, this name might sound familiar to you. Terry Halderman, an adult resident, was visiting her parents when they noticed unexplained bruises on her. Suspecting she was being physically abused, Terry and her family filed a federal class action lawsuit against Pennhurst on behalf of its residents. This triggered an investigation that ultimately exposed the larger issue of unsanitary and inhumane conditions there. Based on hospital records, Terry alone had over 40 documented incidents to include bite marks, lacerations, and bruises. And not all of these came from the staff directly, but it does go to show that the patients lacked the proper supervision needed from staff. And I have read through the original class action complaint document, and to summarize, it says that residents were not provided appropriate care, the staff wasn't properly trained, the buildings weren't adequately furnished, they didn't have the right clothing, they were often sedated because staff just didn't want to deal with them, and they were forced to eat without proper utensils, and there was no toilet paper or hand soap in the bathrooms. And the list just goes on. I highly encourage you to read the original complaint. I will link it in the show notes if you're interested to read it. It goes into so much detail of what truly happened and what really was going on at Pennhurst during this time. There is so much information that goes into this. I can't cover everything in a single episode. So if you are interested in getting all of the details, I will link it in the show notes so you can go and read it for yourself. The Halderman vs. Pennhurst case was actually the first of its kind. The court found conditions there were unconstitutional and ordered the state to develop community-based care or group homes for the patients to be transferred out of Pennhurst. This landmark case lasted for many years and ultimately forced Pennhurst closure in 1987. In the almost 80 years of operation, over 10,000 people lived inside its walls. And it's tough to say how many died there, but it's estimated to be about half. Also during this time in the 1980s, deinstitutionalization was happening across the country where the federal government was closing state institutions. Patients were transferred out of state care to either community-based programs parents or back with family. We know a lot of patients in state hospitals ended up homeless because they had no family, they had nowhere else to go. But surprisingly, according to the Pennhurst longitudinal study, their results gave a much different story. And the reason I bring this up is the results from the study show that these people were much better off once they left Pennhurst. The study followed a little over 1,100 residents and found that zero, I'm going to repeat that again, zero ended up homeless or in jail, which was shocking to me, considering the statistics of when people get out of mental hospitals, the homelessness, going to jail, all of that tends usually to skyrocket. These people also lived longer by at least 6 years, and they became 14% more independent and overall were better off. This speaks volumes about how bad the conditions were at Pennhurst. While these court cases stemmed from the terrible mistreatment of patients, they ultimately brought about some positive change, moving forward the disability rights movement and changing laws to protect the most vulnerable. The biggest outcome of these court cases was the establishment of what's known as the Pennhurst Doctrine. In simple terms, this legal principle ensures that the federal government cannot violate states' rights when it comes to funding. So when states accept federal funding, they must adhere to certain stipulations and obligations. So the federal government says, we're going to give you X amount of money for X. Well, the Pennhurst Doctrine states that Congress cannot impose new or unexpected regulations on those funds without clearly expressing its intent to do so. This doctrine helped define the limits of federal authority in imposing conditions on state-run programs that receive federal money. And you may have heard of the Pennhurst Doctrine, but just didn't know what the name was or where it came from. In fact, it is still relevant today. It was actually brought up just a few years ago in some cases around Obamacare. This institution in small-town Pennsylvania had a profound impact in the legal world all across the country. So now if you're ever reading the news and you see anything legally about the Pennhurst Doctrine, now you know where it came from. So what is Pennhurst now? What's going on with it? The VA, or the Veterans Association, took control of the upper campus, and the lower campus became privately owned. I do know that the current owners of the lower campus have demolished quite a few of the buildings. I know the superintendent's house is gone, the greenhouse is gone, the power plant recently got demolished. I haven't been there in quite some time, but I do see updates and photos of the campus, and I gotta be honest, it breaks my heart. I wish the entire campus could be saved. I have a lot of special memories in a lot of those buildings, and to see them no longer standing is pretty heartbreaking, actually. I believe the current owners offer tours, and of course, every October they put on the very controversial haunted house. And here is what I will say about that. I know some people are very for it, some people are very against it, and I do see both sides of it. I do see the side of, I don't want to say mocking the history, but making it a spectacle or an attraction. I do see how that is hurtful to, patients or families of patients. I totally understand that, and that is very valid. However, in order to save these buildings and to honor the history, it is not cheap. Years ago, I do know how much it costs to abate the smallest building on campus, and it is not a cheap endeavor to abate, to get everything up to code, up to standard, to be able to open it for people to do tours and honor the history. So I do see the business side of it, of you need to make money to be able to save these buildings. And unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, the haunted house is a huge moneymaker. Tons of people go see that every year. There are groups still dedicated to keeping Pennhurst history alive, one being the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance. They have a website you can check out. There is also a cemetery near the upper campus that has a marker dedicated to the residents that passed away. So that is it on Pennhurst State School and Hospital. I hope I gave you a better understanding of the campus, a pretty good overview of the history, my personal time there. If you've been to Pennhurst and you have any memories, I would love to hear them. Love to hear your experience. If you've been there recently, please let me know the state of the campus. Like I said, I haven't been there in a really long time. But thanks for tuning in, everyone, and until next time.